Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, one and all. Thanks for joining us in this edition of Practitioner Series. So we are talking about site reliability engineering, and I have a good friend and an industry veteran, Kurt Anderson, head of strategy for Blameless, joining us. Thanks, Kurt, for joining us today and sharing your valuable insight around anti-patterns in the world of SRE. So I hope you're doing
Thank you
well.
for having me.
Thank
Yeah,
you.
doing great. Thanks.
So let's get a kickstart. But before that, for viewers, please give us an indication of your journey around and what fascinated you to be on the SRE and what's been your experience. So we would love to hear your story and your memory on your career progression.
Sure. Well, I've been working. I started as a software developer. Got promoted or shifted or something into being a system engineer, which actually started kind of my progression into looking at things as a system.
Right.
And that's one of the key characteristics of SREs is the system-wide thinking. Um, I then bounced around through several other jobs. And so I think that I've been doing SRE stuff, caring about reliability for quite a long time before SRE became a recognized term.
Perfect. So what's your definition of an SRE? We all know about the Google definition, but let's have a practitioner definition of what do you mean by site reliability engineering?
I guess there's two parts of it. One is an organizational model,
Right.
where you have designated teams that focus on reliability. So that's the organizational model. The individual model, as far as what SREs do, is that, and what SREs value, is that they focus on sustainable engineering for an appropriate level of reliability. I think people who have read the SRE book or seen various Twitter threads recognize that 100% is not the right target. And I do like to hammer on that. That's a big anti-pattern, is for people to think, oh, we're at 3 nines, let's go for 4.
Absolutely.
And so that's having sustainable focus on reliability to drive your availability, the performance, the agility, and ultimately the reliability of your services is the key practice that SREs carry out.
And what do you think are the prerequisites, considering that an organization wants to implement SRE? We kind of always want to have a pre-required checklist of whether we are possible candidates to be onboarded on SRE. So is that a kind of a blueprint or prerequisites that we need to be aware if an organization wants to start a journey around SRE?
I think so. I think there's two foundational aspects that are really key to being able to instantiate an SRE practice. One is recognizing that reliability is a feature. And it's not like the 10th feature in a row. It needs to be the foundational, the first principle. And even if you aren't there now, the idea that you can appreciate that you have a distance to travel and be interested in undertaking that journey is key. And then as far as how you travel that journey, psychological safety, as studied by Amy Edmondson, and as it plays out like in the organizational typologies that Ron Westrom put forth, you see it recognized in the DevOps research reports from Dora. Psychological safety is key, because if your teams can't feel that they can be safe to fail, they're going to hide things. And then if things are hidden, you're not going to have great reliability. So those are, I would say, are the base foundational aspects.
So can you talk about kind of some of the mistakes or anti-patterns that you've seen in the SRE that you have encountered? And I'm sure that you have had a lot of stories, but you can kind of kickstart and we can bring in some more tailwinds about what things are working. But some of the common anti-patterns or mistakes people think when they get into this SRE journey.
Definitely. I think the number one that is common, and I've had the advantage of participating in the SREcon conferences around the world. and speaking to hundreds of practitioners. And so I'm drawing these not just from my own experience, but from talking to lots of people at the conferences. I'd say number one is the idea that you can just rename existing groups and into SRE, and that makes you SRE. It's the same problem that happened in DevOps, where you just took people and just changed their title and didn't change what they did.
Right.
It's SRE is more than a title. It is what people do. It's the way they think. And so just changing the titles is really a strong anti-pattern.
Absolutely. And I think one of the things that anti-patterns come over just as thinking loud, right? They kind of talk about, okay, so we have this, one is the rebranding that you talked about, ops to SRE. The other aspect that comes in is a part of experimentation and learning. Okay, accept failure as normal. So this is something that people say that we have to make it. But I'm struggling, Kurt, talking and consulting a lot of organizations. Is experimentation and learning is more of a buzzword, but in reality, people don't even pay heed to that. In realistic, how have we seen organizations' attitude or inclination towards experimentation? Is it something that they are really doing, particularly in the scheme of your constrained, limited blast radius?
Yeah, it varies. There are some organizations that really do it and have adopted the mindset of enabling their teams to experiment and have quick iteration, and being able to quickly iterate is key, because if you do something wrong, you can always roll it back. Well, if you have a properly constructed deployment pipeline, that is.
Right.
But there's a lot of companies that, as you say, consider it a utopian ideal that we will never reach. I don't think that needs to be the case. I think the key is really start small, focus. Don't think you're going to radically change everything all at once. Start with some innovation teams, and that seems to be the best practice that I'm observing in the industry, is organizations that realize they need to innovate, realize they need to try new things, charter groups within their organizations to say, okay, you go figure out what new things we should try. We'll try them with one or two teams. And then if it works, we will spread it more widely. If it comes close or it has some improvement, maybe we tweak it and see how it fits into our culture a little bit better.
Right.
That seems to be the best approach. And it shows up even if, I don't know if you've read John Smart's Sooner, Safer, Happier book.
Yeah. Yeah.
He covers that principle that agile transformations with a capital A are an anti-pattern.
Right.
Because it's this thing you're imposing upon the organization. It works much better, especially in a culture of experimentation and learning, to allow that to grow from the ground up.
And that comes also to the next part of the blameless postmortem. More often that's being talked about, and that's another topic that is closer to your heart. Are we really in that span of focusing on a shared ownership? And because it's, again, when you talk about blameless, it also has to do about incentivization of your goals, isn't it? I mean, if I don't have a skin in the game in the whole part, then how can I kind of, do this blameless postmortem? I'm trying to protect myself to look good in front of others. So how do you see that in order to apply a blameless postmortem culture that I've been advocating very much? What are some of the prerequisites that some organizations have to do in place for blameless postmortem to be something sustainable?
I'd say, again, psychological safety is crucial. So like you say, if people are concerned that they have to protect themselves, then they're not going to be able to speak freely. They're not going to be able to look at what is best for the organization. They're not going to be able to look and admit problems. It's like, and some of it even goes back to really old management theory. If you look in the 60s and 70s, the theory X, theory Y type principles of, did people come in with the intent of destroying the system today? And it's like, I think most people tend to react and say, well, no, of course not.
Yeah.
But are you treating people like they did? Um, are you looking at the problem as a component of a distributed socio-technical system where people may not have had the right information, or even if they did have the right information, they may have had incomplete, well, by definition, they have incomplete mental models. You need to understand these other aspects of how the system enables people to understand what the system is doing, and how the system enables or disempowers people to make corrective actions, because the resilience of systems comes from the people component. It doesn't come from the computers.
Correct. Absolutely right. And one of the other things that we are looking at is, okay, these things like incident management, L1, L2, L3 support, the tiered level support that exists. Now with the version of with SRE, has that going to be changing the whole model, that we are going to dismantle all these teams and put them into a squad like kind of a approach? And there's a lot of areas that are confusing for people to look at. Are we going to rebrand ourselves as the incident commander, or in the SRE word? So how do you think the ITIL processes, or now we call it as ITIL practices, are going to change with the evolution of SRE? Is that going to be radically different than the way they conduct themselves and operate?
Over time, and that's a crucial component, things will change.
Right.
That solutions that were structured around protect the devs at all costs from anything the customer might say.
Right.
Because after all, they were just coders at the end of a waterfall.
Right.
If you change some of those mindsets, then the other supporting organizational pieces will change in concert, but you don't just tear the whole thing down.
Right.
This is more like remodeling a house than burning it to the ground and building a new one.
Right.
Go ahead.
It's tricky as we start to through this whole exercise. One of the things that we are talking about as part of site reliability engineering is, what do you think as part of the core values that you would on principles which will help or empower SRE in their journey?
A couple of key things that often get missed and turn into anti-patterns in and of themselves is one, not doing a good job of containing interrupts.
Right.
So the guideline in the SRE book and from Google and in general is make sure that SREs have 50% of their time at least to do engineering work. And if you don't contain interrupts, if you have alerts that are too obnoxious and noisy, if you don't support the team with ancillary roles like technical writers, project managers that you would have for any other dev team, then you're really disempowering the SREs from doing the engineering part of their job.
Right, right, and I think that's also for the point that we are all in together as an enterprise from an end-to-end value chain, and we cannot just segregate some of these people as SREs. And that brings to our next question about what skills do you think are in demand? I mean, as an SRE, it seems to be like a Superman or a Superwoman kind of attribute. What do you kind of your desired skill set that you would recommend for a practitioner or an SRE kind of a role?
Well, first off, I have to say that viewing an SRE as a superhero is, while understandable, it's also a bit of an anti-pattern.
Right.
Because looking at the carrying out heroic level efforts is not sustainable. And so that goes back to the key of SRE is focused on sustainable solutions.
Right.
As far as skills, system-wide understanding and thinking in systems is really an important skill, but it's something that people can learn over time if they're interested. um, a deep understanding of the systems and different aspects of it really is important, because we know that abstractions are leaky,
Right.
to rip off a term from Joel Spolsky.
Right.
And what happens is that when you've got somebody who's only familiar with the framework that they're developing in, let's say React or any other framework, there are these cases where the framework doesn't handle things right, and the details from below bubble up into your perspective. The generalist role and being able to solve those leaky problems is one of the areas that SREs can really help.
Right.
Because most people are focused in some fashion. They're a front-end developer, they're a database engineer of some sort. And how do all these things work together? And that's where the system perspective that SREs bring to the table is important. And people can grow into that. You don't start by learning everything in the world.
Right.
So.
And the other thing that I commonly often encounter is SREs are useful for cloud native applications. When you talk about reliability, it becomes a lot more easier to focus on cloud natives and containerization aspects of it. So in your opinion, if you have, because we call like what Gartner calls like bimodal IT, there'll be certain set of organization will still exist in mainframes and legacy infrastructure. So do you think that there is a place for SRE principles and practices to get applied in the so-called legacy world, as opposed to just the cloud natives and containerization and moving forward? Because that's just a big thing. Hey, will SRE fit for us because we're more of a traditional shop? Or we
Yeah.
need to wait before we come into a application modernization, cloud first strategy and stuff like that. So what's your take on that?
I would say yes, it does apply in the legacy space. We do see that question come up frequently amongst attendees coming to the SREcon conferences, frequently from larger enterprises that have a lot of historical legacy stuff. If you look at it from the principles of measuring the important things and developing an eye for understanding where there are problems, and then solving the problems quickly in a collaborative sense, these practices apply to legacy software. They apply to commercial off-the-shelf software. Now, the problem is that when you're dealing with something that's commercial off-the-shelf, or legacy for that matter, it may not have been well instrumented.
Right.
And so measuring the important characteristics about the service could be really difficult.
Right.
But that doesn't mean it isn't important to do.
Right. And the other aspect around the observability, because that's been more often talked these days around moving away from monitoring to observability, and there's a kind of a full notion that everything will finally go towards becoming an observability kind of a setup. But what's your take around this observability? Is there any kind of a way to start with doing beyond monitoring? Right. We know that according to Mike Dickerson's site reliability hierarchy, you start with monitoring, but if someone wants to do a bit of observability and instrumentation, where do you think they have to put their efforts in as they start through this journey? Because that seems to be a most eluded topic when it comes to site reliability engineering.
Oh, where should you put your effort? Well, I tend to subscribe to the principle that you should buy whatever you can instead of building it yourself.
Right.
There's cases where you have to build it yourself, but if you're getting started, start with something that is generally available. I mean, whether that's open source, which is going to incur costs for you to support yourself, obviously, or whether it's a commercial solution, and I won't name any vendors because we can all go look up on Google what observability vendors there are. But get something, work with your development team, make sure that they are instrumenting your code. OpenTelemetry is an open source API framework for instrumenting observability. So make sure that your code is emitting the data, and then figure out how you want to capture that and make use of it to be able to learn useful things. That's how I tackle it. And again, start small. I mean, don't make this edict that your entire organization shall instrument observability by June 1st. Get a couple of teams and say, hey, let's see what we can find out, and approach it with a sense of curiosity.
Right. And we have a lot of managed services organization where they actually are struggling because some of the vendors, the commercial off-the-shelf product vendors, do not really understand SRE. Forget about it.
Of
So
course not. Yeah.
when I am trying to deal with my end customer, my client, but I have a dependency on my vendor as part of my contractual underpinning contracts, I am in a sandwich position, isn't it? One way I want to really go to that customer reliability engineering aspects like that, but at the other end, I have to tackle these people who are far more primitive in their way they operation. So how do you handle that? Switch between these two episodes.
Um, a lot of difficult conversations, I'd say. Um, it's I think you could point them to a great talk by Dave Renson a couple of years ago, and in the concluding keynote for SREcon, where he talked about everything as a platform. And even if you don't think that your product is a platform, it is, and it's going to be used that way. And the principle is kind of the maker community with remixing things and seeing what you can come up with, applies definitely in the software world. And yeah, it's hard to be more reliable than services you depend on. But there are ways that you can sort of protect yourself to a certain degree against failures in services you depend on.
Right.
But again, those have costs, and that goes back to what I view as the core construct of engineering. What is engineering per se? It's making those trade-offs, the costs versus the benefits, in an informed fashion, and understanding, okay, I can put caches in here, I can put retries, I can do all these different things, I can depend on different AZs, availability zones. Sorry for your audience that may not know the term. And yes, you can do all of those things, but what's it going to cost and what's it going to gain you?
Right.
And that's the trade-off. That is engineering at its core.
Correct. And in terms of one of the things where people struggle and is, hey, you know what? I have a full stack developer. Do I need to have an SRE? So will they actually do the same job? So kind of looking at these two roles, and I was just reading on LinkedIn's top 20 jobs of 2020. Number 4 is full stack developer. Number 5 is site reliability engineering. So the question is that how do you kind of have these both roles work together? Are they complementary? How do they fit in the overall scheme of things in a productized setup, right? And where do you think that we need to leverage that collaboration between these two teams seamlessly? So what's your take on that?
I think they're very complementary. I rather than full stack developer, I think that's a bit of a misnomer also. I saw somebody tweeted a week or two ago that what people should be looking for are full stack teams instead of full stack developers.
Right.
Is a much more sustainable and true to life characterization. And so SREs can engage with development teams in a couple of different models. It ranges anywhere from sort of a consultative model where they might come in and be checking things and helping guide and lead them in good practices for architecture and implementation. Or the team may be central and crucial enough, large enough that they have their own embedded group of SREs. Right. So there's a spectrum there of how the engagements work as well.
And the final question would be, SRE skills are in top demand. There's a lot of positions being opened, but they're not getting filled up. Is there any kind of a real dearth, Kurt, that we are not filling in the right positions? We are kind of missing something for people to get themselves, fit this role as like SRE. So if you're hiring for someone, what do you think should be their core skills or areas that they should be have done that will help them to earn the seat without having a lot of hassles?
I do think there are gaps in the educational model that lead in some ways to the mismatch that you're describing. the difficulty of hiring SREs has been a constant refrain at the conferences as well over time.
Right.
And many companies have found that it is in some ways easier to raise SREs up from amongst their existing employees than to try to hire them from outside, because they can, what you can do is that if you have a group of people and you find some who have a natural proclivity toward generalist system thinking approaches, is that you can help them to foster that aspect of their perspective and their understanding. Now, it's kind of hard to go out and have a job rec that says, yeah, I want somebody who's a generalist and thinks systematically, because who's going to walk in and say, oh no, I'm a very narrow focused thinker and I can't think outside the box. Nobody's going to apply for and say that about themselves, right? So
Right.
that's the challenge of hiring somebody that from outside.
And you've been talking about, I couldn't resist the last question. One of the things you've been talking about is SREcon. So anybody who would like to know more about the conferences, is that SREcon one of the dedicated conferences that you would recommend for people to know? And if people have to know something in Asia, something in this one, where do you think would be they would find resources to understand more of the upcoming conferences and details around SREcon?
Thank you for the chance to talk about it. It is near and dear to my heart. SREcon is one of the Usenix conferences. Thanks to the open access policy that Usenix has, all of the talks from all of the SREcons are available online. And so people can go to usenix.org/SREcon to find out about it. And soon, like by the end of May here, the call for proposals for this year's conference will be opened up.
Sure.
Because in prior years, pre-pandemic, we actually had in-person conferences. We had one in Asia, one in North America, and one in Europe.
Right.
This year, again, because of the uncertainties around where regions would be open, we're going to do a single global event that will span time zones and has times. It's going to have time blocks that work well for Europe, reasonably well for sort of Australia, Japan, the West Coast of the United States. So we've got 2 time blocks, and the other places kind of fit in. If you're willing to get up early in India, you'll be able to catch the European chunk. So we've tried to arrange the timings to work for a global audience.
Awesome. I think that's so much of great information packed in 25 minutes. Thank you so much, Kurt, for sharing your insights. I'm hoping that we'll get more participations on SREcon. I'm looking forward to probably meeting in one of the conferences as things open up. So thank you so much for sharing.
That would be great.
Yeah.
Well, thank you for having me.
Thank you.